Okay guys, so now let's look at this threshold and ratio in more detail. Alright, here I have the compressor laid out as a dB scale. Alright, at the top of the scale is 0 dB, our maximum level that we cannot go above when we're working in digital, and then the scale works down from there in minus dB figures as far as minus 10. Okay, now you can set your threshold on a compressor lower than minus 10. You can set it to minus 20, minus 30, minus 40, etc. But for the sake of this tutorial, this scale from 0 dB down to minus 10 will be enough for us to see what's happening. Okay. So here's the compressor laid out as a dB scale, right? And the signal, let's get my pen, the signal comes in at the input, passes through our compressor circuit, our automatic amp that we'll represent with this fader icon like that, and then the signal goes out of the output at the other side. Okay. Now, here at the input is a zoomed in peak in the audio, right? Like we're looking at a zoomed in peak. And then here is the same peak leaving the compressor at the output. Now if the automatic amp, the compressor circuit, does not turn the signal down, then the peak leaving the compressor will be at exactly the same dB level as it was coming into the compressor at the input. But if the automatic amp, the compressor circuit, does turn the signal down, then the peak leaving the compressor at the output will be lower in level than it is coming in at the input. And the amount that it gets turned down by, as we've already learned, is set with the ratio. Okay. Now we're going to look at the ratio first, but before we do, there's something I want to tell you about the threshold. Right? It's normal to represent the threshold, as we've already seen, with a horizontal line. Right? So let's do that. There's our horizontal line representing the threshold, right? And we set it to some reference level, usually a minus dB figure below 0. I'll set it to minus 5 like that. Now most beginners tutorials will explain the threshold like this. The person doing the tutorial will put a horizontal line across representing the threshold, and then they'll say the following. They'll say, okay, so here's our threshold. Any signals below the threshold do not get compressed. Any signals that go above the threshold will be compressed. Okay, now that's actually incorrect, right? And I'll explain why it's incorrect in a minute. But first we have to get the ratio down so we really understand that before we can come back and understand this quirk with the threshold, right? So let's look at the ratio first, right? So, ratio. Let me just write that word in. A ratio, right? Now, as we know already, the ratio is the amount that the compressor will turn the signal down by. Okay, now you've probably all seen compression ratios like this. 2 to 1. 4 to 1. 8 to 1. And 12 to 1. Right? These are all compression ratios. And a compression ratio is a pair of numbers divided by a colon. Okay? Now, ratio is just an expression of one amount versus another amount. So let's say you've got a restaurant and you've got 100 meat eaters and 50 vegetarians, right? So your ratio of meat eaters to vegetarians is 2 to 1. There are 2 meat eaters for every 1 vegetarian. 50 goes into 100 2 times, right? Or if you've got 100 meat eaters and 25 vegetarians, then your ratio of meat eaters to vegetarians is 4 to 1. Right? There are 4 meat eaters for every vegetarian. 25 goes into 100 4 times. Right? So a ratio is just an expression of one amount versus another amount. And in compression, it's an expression, the compression ratio that you see is an expression of the input level versus the output level if compression takes place. And the higher the figure on the left, the stronger the compression. The more the signal is turned down by, the more gain reduction is applied. Okay. So let's quickly look at these 4 ratios, right? Let's draw in our threshold, right? This is our threshold. We've set it to some reference level. It doesn't matter what that is at this point, right? But there's our threshold. Okay, and the signal comes into the compressor at the input and then leaves the compressor at the output. Okay, now let's look at these ratios. 2 to 1, that's gentle compression, and that just means that for every 2 dB that the signal goes over threshold at the input, we'll only see a rise of 1 dB over threshold at the output. The signal is reduced by a ratio of 2 to 1, right? And then if we have 4 to 1 ratio, which is stronger compression, that just means that for every 4 dB that the signal goes over threshold at the input, again we'll only see a rise of 1 dB over threshold at the output. The signal is reduced by a ratio of 4 to 1, right? And then if we have stronger compression still, 8 to 1 compression, that just means that for every 8 dB that the signal goes over threshold at the input, again we'll only see a rise of 1 dB over threshold at the output. The signal is reduced by a ratio of 8 to 1. Yeah, and if we got stronger compression still, 12 to 1, that just means that for every 12 dB that the signal goes over threshold at the input, again we'll only see a rise of 1 dB over threshold at the output. The signal is reduced by a ratio of 12 to 1. Okay, so the ratio is just an expression of how much the signal is going to be reduced by as a ratio, input versus output. Right? Let's go back and look at our dB scale here. All right, and let's look at 3 different compression ratios. 2 to 1, 4 to 1, and 8 to 1. All right, 8 to 1. Right, so let's set our threshold. Okay, using the orange line, we can set our threshold to any reference level below 0 dB. We'll say working in digital with a plugin for the sake of this tutorial, right? So I can set my threshold to -1, -2, -3, etc. So I'll set my threshold to -8 dB. And now the compressor can begin to analyze the signal at the input against that reference level. Now let's say at the input the signal goes over threshold, our peak goes over threshold by 8 dB like that, right? 8 dB over threshold. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay. Now if we've got 2 to 1 ratio, the signal has gone over threshold at input by 8 dB. 2 to 1 ratio, 2 into 8 is 4. So at the output, our signal is reduced. So it's only 4 dB over threshold at the output. It's been reduced by a ratio of 2 to 1, which is basically 50%, right? If the ratio is 4 to 1, our signal has gone over threshold at the input by 8 dB. 4 to 1 ratio, 4 into 8 is 2. So at the output, our signal is reduced, so it's only 2 dB over threshold at the output. It's been reduced by a ratio of 4 to 1. And if our ratio is 8 to 1, the signal's gone over threshold at input by 8 dB, 8 to 1 ratio, 8 into 8 is 1. So at the output, our signal is reduced, so it's only 1 dB over threshold at the output. It's been reduced by a ratio of 8 to 1. Right? Simple, yeah? Okay, but you mustn't get confused. The signal doesn't have to go over threshold by 2 dB to get 2 to 1 compression. The signal doesn't have to go over threshold by 4 dB to have 4 to 1 compression. And the signal doesn't have to go over threshold by 8 dB to get 8 to 1 compression, right? Whatever you set the ratio to, that's the amount of compression that will be applied no matter how much the signal goes over threshold at the input. So let's say that the ratio is 8 to 1. Let's get rid of these two. Let's say the ratio is 8 to 1, okay? 8 to 1 ratio. Now, At the input, the signal has gone over threshold by 8 dB. The ratio is 8 to 1, and as we've already seen, 8 dB over, 8 to 1, 8 into 8 is 1, so at the output the signal will be reduced so that it's only 1 dB over threshold at the output. It's been reduced by a ratio of 8 to 1, right? But if 8 to 1 is our ratio, it doesn't matter how much the signal goes over threshold, we'll get 8 to 1 ratio. So if the signal goes over threshold at the input by only 4 dB, like that, 1, 2, 3, 4, if we set the ratio to 8 to 1, we'll still get 8 to 1 compression. The signal's gone over by 4 dB, 8 to 1 ratio, 8 into 4 is a half, so at the output our signal is reduced, so it's just half a dB over threshold at the output. It's still been reduced by a ratio of 8 to 1 because that's the ratio we've set. And again, if the signal goes over threshold by 2 dB, if the ratio is 8 to 1, we'll still get 8 to 1 compression. The signal's over by 2 dB, 8 to 1 ratio, 8 into 2 is a quarter, so at the output our signal will be reduced, so it's just a quarter of a dB over threshold at the output. It's still been reduced by a ratio of 8 to 1. And finally, and obviously, if the signal only goes over threshold by just 1 dB, like that, if our ratio is 8 to 1, we'll still get 8 to 1 compression. Signal's gone over threshold at the input by 1 dB, 8 to 1 ratio, 8 into 1 dB over is an eighth, so at the output our signal is reduced so that it's only an eighth of a dB over threshold at the output, but it's still been reduced by a ratio of 8 to 1. All right? Okay. So you should have that now, ratio. All right? So now that we've got ratio down, let's just get rid of this. We can now go back and look at the threshold and look at that quirk that I told you about at the beginning. Now, as I said, most beginners' tutorials, the tutor will use a horizontal line to set the reference level, the threshold, like that, and then they'll explain the threshold like this. They'll say, okay, here's the threshold. Any signals below threshold are not compressed. Any signals that go over the threshold are compressed. And as I said, that is incorrect. And the reason it's incorrect is that compressors have different types of knee. Okay, now when I say that, I don't mean we are the knights who say knee. I mean knee spelt like that, like the knee on your leg. Okay, now compressors have different types of knee, and that means that compressors have different ways that they respond to signals at the input approaching and crossing the threshold that you've set. So what is this knee, and why is it spelt like that, like knee, like the knee on your leg? Well, it's because of this. Okay, like that. It's because it's taken from the angle of a knee on a leg. A hard knee compressor is represented by this shape, a vertical leading up to the horizontal. A soft knee compressor is represented by this shape, a gentle slope leading up to the horizontal. But in both cases, the horizontal is the threshold that we set. Right? So compressors respond differently to signals approaching and crossing the threshold depending whether they're hard or soft knee. With a hard knee compressor, below threshold nothing happens at all. But as soon as the signal crosses the threshold, no matter by how much, then you get compression being applied at the full ratio, whatever you've set it to. But with a soft knee compressor, the compression comes on progressively. As the signal starts to get louder and louder and creeps up the gentle slope of the soft knee approaching the threshold, a soft knee compressor starts to apply a little bit of compression, but not the full ratio. And then the signal gets a bit louder and climbs up the soft knee a bit further. The compressor applies a little bit more compression, but still not the full ratio. And then finally the signal crosses the threshold, and then and only then do you get the full ratio being applied. Right? Let's go back and look at that on our dB scale. Here's our threshold represented by a horizontal line, but now let's change it to a hard knee threshold, like that. The horizontal is the actual threshold, right? So there is the threshold set at 0 dB. I can set it to -1, -2, -3, etc., right? So I'll set the threshold to -6. And this is a hard knee compressor, right? So let's say that our compression ratio is 4:1. We've set the ratio to 4:1. All right, and we've set our threshold to -6, and now the compressor begins to analyze the signal at the input against that -6 dB threshold. But we've got a hard knee compressor, and this is what happens. Here's the signal at the input. Right? Below threshold, nothing happens at all, right? And signals at the input, they climb up this vertical cliff face approaching the threshold, right? Nothing happens, nothing happens, nothing happens, nothing happens. Even there, where the signal is just below threshold, still nothing happens. But then as soon as the signal crosses the threshold, no matter by how much, we get full compression ratio being applied. So the signal is knocked back, reduced by the full compression ratio, in this case 4:1, when it crosses the threshold. But below threshold, nothing happens. Okay, that's hard knee compression. But now, like that, let's change our threshold for a soft knee threshold. Boom, like that. Now again, the horizontal is the actual threshold, right? So there it is. There's the threshold set to 0 dB, and I can set it to -1, -2, -3, etc. Again, I'll set it to -6. So I've set my threshold to -6 dB, but now it's a soft knee compressor. Our ratio is 4:1. And now what happens is this. Here's the signal peak at the input. If the signal at input is down here, well below threshold, nothing happens. Nothing happens. Nothing happens. But then the signal at input starts to get a bit loud. It starts to creep up that slope of the soft knee, getting a bit louder. It starts going up the soft knee, approaching the threshold. So at this point, the signal's got a bit loud. It's about 3 dB below threshold. So at this point, the compressor will apply a little bit of compression, but not the full 4:1 ratio. At this point, the compressor will apply maybe 1.5:1 compression. So we'll get a little bit of compression, and the signal will be reduced just a little bit. A little bit of compression ratio will be applied, but not the full 4:1. Right? Okay, and then the signal input gets a bit louder still. It creeps up that soft knee a little bit further towards the threshold. Now it's about 2 dB below threshold. So a little bit more compression ratio is applied, but still not the full 4:1 that we dialed in. Now we'll get a little bit more compression, maybe at this point 2:1. So the signal is knocked back just a little bit more, but still not the full 4:1 ratio. Okay, and then the signal input gets a little bit louder still. It creeps up that soft knee, getting even closer to the threshold. Now it's just 1 dB below threshold. So at this point, we'll get about 3:1 ratio being applied, but still not the full 4:1. So the signal gets about 3:1 ratio. It gets knocked back just a little bit more. A little bit more compression ratio is applied, but still not the full 4:1. And then finally, the signal actually crosses the threshold. And then, and only then, we get full compression ratio being applied, no matter how much the signal goes over threshold. So let's say the signal goes over threshold by 4 dB. Ratio is set to 4:1, and now we get full 4:1 compression. So at the output, the signal is reduced, so it's only 1 dB over threshold. 4 dB over at input, 1 dB over at output. It's been reduced by a ratio now of 4:1. So that is the difference between a hard and a soft knee compressor. Okay, and let's go back to here. So hard knee compressors, you can think of them as being more surgical. You set your reference level, your threshold, and you know that only signals that go over that threshold will be compressed at the full ratio. But below that, no compression will apply, right? But a soft knee compressor is progressive. The compression comes on progressively. The nearer you get to the threshold, the more ratio you get until you cross the threshold, and then you get full ratio compression. Okay. Now that doesn't mean that a hard knee compressor is very noticeable all the time, that you can always hear it working, or that a soft knee compressor, because the compression comes on progressively, is subtle and you don't notice it working. Right? You can make a hard knee compressor very subtle, so you don't notice it working at all, you don't hear it working. And you can make a soft knee compressor very noticeable, so you really hear it pumping away and working like mad. Okay, but that's the difference between the two. All right. Now, compressors are either hard knee compressors or soft knee compressors in their response. Some compressors can be switched between hard or soft knee. Like the Alesis 3060 can be switched to be either a hard knee or a soft knee compressor. I think it's the same with the Rupert Neve Portico. It can be switched between hard or soft knee, right? So some compressors are fixed hard or soft knee, and some can be switched between hard or soft knee, and some compressors, usually plug-in ones, can have a variable knee, right? And that means that with a variable knee compressor, you have a pot or a slider that allows you to adjust the knee of the compressor. And when you move that pot or slider, you're adjusting the knee between a hard knee, and then as you move the adjuster, you're making the knee softer and softer and softer like that, between hard and soft. And the softer the knee is, you can kind of say, then the further below threshold the compressor will begin to respond and apply a little bit of compression, but not the full ratio. But you only get full ratio when it crosses the threshold. If you make the compressor hard knee, below threshold nothing happens, and you only get compression at the full ratio when the signals actually cross threshold. Right? So some compressors you can set a variable knee, but that's usually a plug-in compressor. Right? So there you have it. That is soft knee and hard knee compressors, right? And the horizontal is the threshold. We have soft and hard knee compressors, and that is why it is incorrect to say with compressors that any signals below threshold are not compressed and any signals above threshold are compressed. The correct way to describe the threshold is like this. You say the threshold is a reference level that the compressor uses to measure the signal against, and any signals that go over threshold are compressed at the full compression ratio. That's the correct way to describe the threshold. All right. So that's threshold and ratio in depth, right? You should really understand them now. Okay. And now that we've got that down, let's move on and look at the next two parameters of the compressor, which is the attack and the release.